everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. So today's webinar is our 6th webinar in our series of 10 Code Total HR webinars that we're doing. And today we're going to be talking about managing staff performance. It's lovely to see so many of you joining us today, in particular several of our Total HR members as well, which is great. Now, I'm sure you've all got patients to be getting back to, so we will be making a prompt start now. So firstly then, to introduce myself, my name's Hannah and I'm one of the HR advisors here within the Code team. So we're just going to quickly talk about the aims and objectives of today's session. So the aim of today's webinar is to increase your understanding of the correct process for managing poor performance through both informal and formal procedures, and to help you comply with employment legislation. The objectives of today's session will be to discuss an overview of employee rights relating to dismissal for reasons of capability, and to highlight the risks of ignoring poor performance. We're also going to explore how Code Total HR provides useful policies and template letters to help you comply with your legal obligations. Now, the learning outcomes from today's session will be to avoid potentially costly mistakes when implementing the capability process, to improve your understanding of the benefits of carrying out appraisals, and to understand statutory employment rights relating to dismissal on the grounds of capability. So in order to achieve all these objectives, aims and outcomes, we're going to go through today informal performance management, what it is, how to do it and the benefits of it, how to conduct an appraisal. I'm going to help you understand when to instigate the formal capability procedure, and how to use performance improvement plans and competence records as part of the formal capability procedure. We're also going to talk about how to manage your underperforming self-employed associates and how to minimise the risk of a tribunal. Now, first of all, we're going to look at informal performance management. So one of the things that we really focus on here within the Code Total HR team is prevention rather than cure. So that's preventing the poor performance occurring in the first place. Now, there are a number of ways that you can do that, and a key way of preventing poor performance is by having a thorough and robust induction and training plan. That will help you explain to the team member when they first join the practice what your expectations are, what are the main duties within their role, so they fully understand that. You can also then back this up by having job descriptions in place. So these detail those main duties, those main tasks, those main roles, and the expectations as well. Another way to prevent poor performance is by implementing a staff handbook and issuing that to your team members to read and sign. By having that staff handbook in place, it will help them understand how you will deal with poor performance. And within that staff handbook, that should include a capability policy and procedure, which we'll talk about in a bit more detail later on. Now, one of the key parts of informal performance management is having one-to-one meetings with your team member. Now, these are meetings to address any concerns that you've got with a team member. So raise their concerns, bring them to their attention because they may not already be aware of them, and detail what you expect them to do to improve. So to give you an example, we recently had a practice owner get in contact with us on the helpline who had concerns about his practice manager and them not fulfilling elements of their role. Now, upon talking to the practice owner, it became apparent that they hadn't had much of an induction, they didn't have much time to complete that, and they also hadn't been issued with a job description. So we became aware that actually they might not be sort of aware of these elements that they weren't fulfilling in their role. So it's really important to detail those to them during these one-to-one meetings so they fully understand those expectations. Now, a key part of any performance management procedure, whether that's informal or formal, is training and support. So providing the team member with the training and support to be able to complete their role. Now, the outcome, the objective of any performance management procedure should be to give that team member the skills and abilities to be able to complete their role to the standards that you expect. You may also need to consider GP and occupational health reports, particularly if that informal performance management is related to a medical condition. So let's talk about these regular one-to-one meetings in a bit more detail. Now, prior to holding a regular one-to-one meeting, or even just a one-off one-to-one meeting, it's important that you plan for that meeting. So you plan what you want to address with that team member, but also gather any evidence or examples that you want to provide to that team member so they fully understand the concern that you have. But it's also important to plan where you're going to hold that meeting. So have you got a confidential meeting room that you can use to ensure you're not interrupted? You dedicate that time to the team member, but also with it being confidential, both yourselves as the line manager and the employee will feel comfortable raising any concerns that they may have that you may not already be aware of. So during the one-to-one meeting, state to them the problem. Explain to them that problem so they fully understand and are aware of a problem. But again, provide them with those examples and evidence to help back up your concern. But also give them the opportunity to feed back to you. Is there anything potentially you're not aware of that you should be? Is there maybe anything going on outside of work that you're not aware of? By having that confidential meeting room, that will give them the opportunity and they'll feel more comfortable in discussing that with you. And by being aware of those issues, that will help you manage them. But also detail to the team member your expectations, what standard you expect them to improve to and what you expect them to be doing. Talk about training and support. So what training do you feel they might need, or what support do you feel they might need to achieve those expectations, as well as what support do they feel they need, what training do they feel they need. So it's important to make sure you agree that and you implement that. Now that can coincide with your action points. So agree the action points for the meeting, and ideally if you can mutually agree these action points. If the team member is happy with those action points, agrees to them, they are more likely to complete them. But also make sure those action points and objectives are SMART objectives. So specific, measurable, achievable, realistic and time bound. By having all those elements, again, the team member is more likely to achieve those action points. Agree timescales as well. Timescales of when you want them to achieve those action points. What are the deadlines? And in accordance with those deadlines and those timescales, arrange your review meeting and make sure you stick to that review meeting to ensure there's continuous and ongoing performance management of that team member. Again, to give you another example, we had a practice owner call us. They have dedicated their I comply completion to one particular team member. Now, when they logged onto the system to retrieve a document, they noticed that they were quite behind with I comply and they were unsure why. It was the first time that they become aware of this. They called us on the helpline to establish what was best to do. Now, in this situation, we recommended to them that they sit down with that team member, explain to them, they've logged onto I comply and they've noticed that they're behind with the cycle. Is everything okay? What's happened? And talk about those reasons why and put those action plans in place with that team member to get on top of the cycle, which they have now done. Appraisals then. Appraisals are another really useful tool to help you manage your team members' performance. Now, an appraisal is a two-way discussion between the line manager and the team member, and during that discussion they should be reviewing the past year, so what's happened over the past year, as well as talking about the future. And the team member should gain an insight into their progress over the last year. Appraisals are also a CQC requirement. So the CQC expect you to complete appraisals, not just with your employed team members, but also with your self-employed team members as well. But there are a number of benefits to doing this. So by having that communication channel with your team member, it helps improve their morale. It helps improve their engagement within the practice. But it also provides you with a forum to address any issues or concerns that you have as well. So there are a number of benefits to them. Now, a really useful tool that you can use to prepare for your appraisals is an appraisal questionnaire. Now, this is a document that sets out a number of questions that the team member should complete. Now, we recommend you give these appraisal questionnaires to your team members about 2 weeks prior to the appraisal meeting being held. That would then give them enough time to review the questions and think about them and complete their answers. But we also recommend you ask them to return them to you with a minimum of 2 days prior to the meeting. That then gives you, the line manager, time to review anything they've written on there, anything potentially you weren't already aware of that maybe you need to look into in more detail, or maybe you need to prepare something in addition to the meeting. So they're a really useful tool to help both you, the line manager, and the employee prepare for the appraisal. Another useful tool to help you prepare is an advanced briefing. Now, quite often team members can be sceptical about the reasons for an appraisal. They are concerned that maybe they're going to get in trouble, maybe there's going to be problems that are raised. But during an appraisal, nothing should be raised that's a surprise. Everything should have been potentially dealt with during that one-to-one meeting. So an appraisal is an overview, a recap of the last year. But team members naturally can be concerned, they can be anxious about what's going to occur within that meeting. But some of them can also think it's the opportunity for a pay rise. They might think appraisals are a link to a pay rise, which isn't always the case. So by having that appraisal questionnaire, it sets out to them what the expectations are during the meeting and what will be discussed during the meeting. Now, this advanced briefing also reiterates that to them as well. So you could hold an advanced briefing during your practice management meeting, your practice team meeting, to explain to all team members that you're going through the appraisal process. You could use our staff appraisal meeting document on iComply to detail the dates and times of all your appraisals, to give that to your team members so they know when they are, and explain to them during this briefing what you'll be discussing during the appraisal. Reassure them about that appraisal process. So again, they're hopefully not so anxious about it and they understand why you're doing it. Now, during an appraisal process, there's a number of different things that you should be covering, but it's important prior to that meeting to plan. So as I mentioned earlier, go through your appraisal questionnaire, talk about and review what you want to talk about during that meeting. But it's also important to plan that meeting room. So the same with your one-to-one meetings. Make sure you have a confidential environment where both parties feel happy to discuss and talk about any issues they have, but also somewhere where you're not going to be disturbed, so you can dedicate that time to the team members so they feel valued. Now, during that appraisal, you should be reviewing the main duties. Review the main duties of their role, so the things they complete on a day-to-day, week-by-week, and month-by-month basis. And talk about over the past year with those main duties, what have they done well? Give them praise where it's due. That will really support improving their morale. But also where things perhaps haven't gone so well and things could have been improved, talk about that with the team member. But make sure when you're talking about that, any criticism you're giving is constructive so that they don't feel demoralised, but they also have something to work on moving forwards. They have something to improve upon and they understand why. Another key part of your appraisal process will be to talk about training requirements. So that's potentially training requirements that you feel the team member would benefit from, but also potentially they feel they might benefit from in accordance with those improvements that you've discussed. Now, when you're talking about training requirements, you can delegate that to the team member. So if you agree particular training that team member needs, you can say to that team member, go away, do some research, have a look into suitable courses and come back to me with a few ideas. Another key element of an appraisal is to talk about the future. So do you as the line manager have any plans for the practice moving forward? What's your intentions over the next year? But also it's an opportunity for the team member to talk to you about their career aspirations. Where do they want to be? What do they want to achieve? What's their goal? And by allowing them that opportunity, that can help you with succession planning in the future. If you potentially have a vacancy, you maybe know who's interested in covering that vacancy, so it really helps with that succession planning. It's also important to assume, not to assume, that for your employees who are potentially a bit older, that they might retire in the near future. That would risk an age discrimination claim. So ask the same questions to everyone. Ask everyone what their career aspirations are. But in line with talking about the future, talk about objectives. What do you want that team member to achieve over the next year? And when you're talking about those objectives and actions moving forward, again, make sure they're mutually agreed. If they're mutually agreed with that team member, they are more likely to be achieved. But again, also remember, make sure they're SMART objectives. Now, a key part of any appraisal should be an overall assessment. And there is a section within our appraisal reports on iComply that details that overall assessment. So that's the assessment of the standard and level that you think the team member is performing at. Now, it is good if you can to mutually agree that assessment. So the team member will hopefully agree with you where they think they are performing at. But not always does that happen. Sometimes they may disagree, particularly if they think they're performing better than you, the line manager, do. And that's why it's really important to plan prior to the meeting, so you have that evidence and you have that documentation to support why you are giving that team member that overall assessment that you are. Now, throughout the whole appraisal process, it's important to ask open questions, have that two-way conversation with the team member to allow that sort of information flowing, that discussion. But also remember to listen. Listening skills are really important during an appraisal process. Give that team member the opportunity to speak to you. Raise any concerns that they may have or anything potentially you want to discuss with you that they haven't already done so. So make sure you listen thoroughly to that team member, take on board anything they said and potentially action anything that's necessary. Also consider your body language during an appraisal. Be open, be positive, and the team member's more likely to reciprocate that as well. A really useful tool for you to use during an appraisal is a form, a documentation. So again, such as our reports on iComply. This will really help you keep on track during that appraisal process. It gives you that structure, those questions, those topics that you want to cover during the meeting. And that will help you go through that meeting in a sort of structured process, cover everything that you need to do. Now, we recommend usually the appraisal should last for about an hour. So by having that structure, that will assist you during that process. Now, it is important that appraisals are documented. So document those appraisals so you've got that documentation in place to evidence them. Now, some managers prefer to write up the appraisal as and when it's happening. Some prefer to write it up afterwards. Whichever is absolutely fine, whichever you're most comfortable with. But whichever method you choose, it's important to ensure that you have that documentation in place and it's accurate and it's signed by the employee. So once you've got that completed appraisal report, give it to the team member to read and ask them to sign to confirm it's an accurate reflection of a discussion. And it'd be useful for you to hold that documentation on file, particularly if there is a performance management concern and you are having to escalate that. You've got that documentation in place to support you then. Now, talking about escalating that process, that may be potentially to a capability procedure. So a capability is a formal procedure that you should follow to manage performance. Now, capability refers to the lack of skills, aptitude and knowledge for that team member to complete that role to the standards expected. It can also encompass a number of other things. So this could include sort of ill health as well. Now, we will be doing a webinar in the new year talking about sickness, where we'll talk about sort of poor performance linked to ill health or long-term sick in a bit more detail. Another reason that the capability procedure would be appropriate is the loss of a skill or qualification that enables the team member to complete their role. Now, this is particularly important in regards to your GDC registration. So for instance, in August, we had a lot of calls from practice owners, practice managers who were concerned about dental nurses who hadn't renewed their GDC registration. That would be when it's appropriate to instigate the capability policy and procedure because they're not able to complete their role without that qualification. Now, we quite often get calls on the helpline with queries about the difference between the capability procedure and the disciplinary procedure. Now, the disciplinary procedure relates to conduct. So that would be in the instance where the team members is choosing not to perform. So they're choosing not to perform rather than they're not able to perform, rather than they don't have the skills, aptitude or ability to perform. So that's the key difference with your disciplinary procedure. Now, with your capability procedure, as I mentioned earlier, it's really important throughout the formal procedure to talk about training and support and detail that to the employee, detail that to the team member and agree that with them. Now, our capability procedure, and there's a number of capability procedures out there, but today I'm going to focus on the one that we've got on iComply and the stages within that. So the capability procedure should be held by the line manager. The line manager should be holding those formal meetings with them. Now, there are a number of stages within our capability procedure on iComply. The first stage is the requirement to hold informal meetings with them. Now, this can encompass your one-to-one meetings and your appraisals, which is why it's really important to document both of those meetings so you have that confirmation that you're adhering to stage one of the capability procedure, which is those informal meetings. Now, stage two of your capability procedure is the first formal meeting. Now, with your formal capability meetings, that team member is entitled to written notice of the meeting, and we recommend a minimum of 3 days' notice. Now, during that meeting, you should talk about their performance. What are your concerns? Talk about the informal meetings you've had, those one-to-one meetings, those appraisals, and what you've discussed, what progress that team member's made, but also still where they're not meeting the standards expected. Talk about training and support. Put those actions in place to enable that team member to perform to the standard that you want and agree those review dates. Now, those review dates tie in with stage 3 of our capability policy and procedure. Now, stage 3 is again another formal meeting, and it's a case of during this meeting to review the progress they've made since stage 2. So review those actions you've put in place, review what progress they've made, review what they've achieved, but also review what they still need to achieve going forward, and agree further actions, further targets for them to work towards. Now, the fourth stage of the capability procedure is the consideration for dismissal. So if you've gone through those informal stages, you've gone through those formal stages, you may need to consider dismissal. And I'll talk about this in a bit more detail in a moment. Because it's important to remember during the capability procedure, there can be a number of different avenues, number of different routes to seek and explore. Now, each capability procedure is unique to every individual because it's their skills that they're lacking. They'll be different for every single person. So we recommend you seek advice if you're completing a capability procedure with anyone to ensure that you're covering all those different avenues. If you end up in a tribunal situation, the tribunal will look to see that you've been reasonable, you've been fair, and you've given the employee every opportunity possible. Now, during those formal capability meetings, the team member has the right to be accompanied. Now, they have the right to be accompanied by either a work colleague or a trade union representative. Now, sometimes they can ask to be accompanied by someone else. Although they have no right to do this, it is good that you consider this. And there's been lots of recent case law where employers have been deemed unreasonable when they have refused a request for someone else to be representative. So to give you a few examples, it would be reasonable to consider a request and agree to a request for a team member to be accompanied by a translator. So that would be reasonable. You may also get requests from potentially your younger team members who wish to be accompanied by a parent. Now, we appreciate these can be particularly difficult meetings because naturally your parent's going to be protective of their children, but it is important to consider that request. Now, if you're ever in the situation where you are considering refusing the request to be accompanied, please seek advice because there are risks with doing that. Now, during the meeting, the companion can be involved in that meeting. They can address the meeting and they can confer with the team member. They have the right to do that. Now, an important and really useful tool for you to use during a formal capability procedure is a competence record. Now, we have a number of them on iComply, and you can see on the screen the one we have for a dental nurse. Now, on these competence records, it details a number of the key duties, the key tasks within that role, and it gives you the opportunity to review whether the team member is capable of completing that role or whether potentially they need further training and support. So you can identify those skills and knowledge gaps and implement the training and support required for them to be able to improve. It's also a really useful tool for an audit trail. So as part of your formal capability procedures, having this competence record gives you that audit trail that you are supporting the team member. You may also wish to consider implementing a performance improvement plan. Now, for our total HR members, this is something we can support you in doing as well. We can help you create one of these. Now, a performance improvement plan details the concerns that you have about the performance, the expectations, and the actions you're going to put in place, again, including training and support. It's also another really useful tool for you to help review that team member's progress. So potentially every 2 weeks, you could be updating these documents with any progress they've made, any further actions, any training, any support. But also during your formal meetings, your formal capability meetings, you can review these documents to enhance that audit trail as well. Now, dismissal. I mentioned earlier that dismissal is a consideration within the capability policy and procedure. But once you've gone through all those informal meetings, your one-to-one meetings, your appraisals, your formal meetings, competence records, performance improvement plans, you may be in the situation that actually that team member hasn't improved to the standard that you require them to. So you may need to consider dismissal. Now, prior to making that decision to dismiss a team member, you need to consider all alternatives available to you. And again, if you end up in that tribunal situation, that is something that the tribunal will expect you to do. Now, to give you an example, about 6 months ago, we helped a practice owner who had concerns about the performance of their practice manager. Now, they went through a capability procedure with them. It was a really robust capability procedure. They had a number of formal meetings above and beyond the procedure, which was really great. They had a really robust audit trail. When it came to that dismissal meeting, they recently had a treatment coordinator resign, so they had that position available for them, and they offered that to the practice manager. The practice manager had been with them for a long time, been promoted throughout the years, and it was really the people management side of the role that they were struggling with. And they acknowledged that because the practice owner had been so supportive, they'd gone through such a robust procedure, they were really keen to remain within the practice and they accepted that role. Now, we recently caught up with that practice owner and they were really pleased to report that actually that team member's thriving in that practice, in the treatment coordinator role. It's really the role for them, and they acknowledge that perhaps the practice manager role wasn't. So it's really important to consider those alternatives. Now, those alternatives are not just demotion. It can also be removal of duties. So again, in this instance, would it be appropriate to remove the people management element from that role? Now, we appreciate within small practices that can be really difficult and it's not always possible. But if it is possible, it's something you need to be considering. You may also want to consider, if you're a multi-site practice, whether it would be appropriate to transfer the team member to another one of your sites. Would that help solve the issue? But if you end up in the situation that you've considered all alternatives available to you, there are none, and you have to dismiss that team member, it's ideally important that if you can, that dismissal meeting is held impartially. So if, for instance, your capability policy and procedure, the number of formal stages are held by your line manager, that could be the practice manager, which may potentially leave the practice owner free for the dismissal meeting. Now, we appreciate, again, within small practices, that can be really difficult to achieve that impartiality. So you may need to consider getting in someone external to mitigate your risk. If you do terminate a employee, they are entitled to notice pay in accordance with their contract. And we recommend that you pay that notice to them in lieu, rather than we're asking them to work that notice. They can be particularly disruptive, disengaged if they do work that notice period. So we recommend that you pay that to them in lieu. They're also entitled to a written outcome. Now, they're entitled to a written outcome to every stage of the formal capability procedure, including the dismissal stage. So that written outcome should include the outcome of the meeting, so dismissal in this instance, the reasons for that, but also the line of appeal. Now, team members are entitled to appeal all formal decisions within the capability process, including dismissal. And again, ideally, like with your dismissal, this should be held impartially. And again, we appreciate this can be difficult, so for your appeal, again, you may need to consider getting in someone external to mitigate your risk. Now, if the team member wants to appeal that decision, they should put that in writing to you, and they should state their grounds for the appeal. You should then arrange that appeal meeting, ideally within 7 days of receipt of that appeal. And during that appeal meeting, it's that team member's opportunity to explain to you why they're appealing, what's their thoughts, what's the reasoning. And the appeal officer can also question them as well to understand in a bit more detail. Now, quite often during appeal meetings, there can be a lot of information to take in. So if the appeal officer can't make a decision there and then, that's absolutely fine. And it can be considered best practice to go away and take some time to think about it. But we recommend you come back to them sort of as soon as possible, maybe 24, 48 hours afterwards. But in absolute latest, you should be going back to them sort of 7 days after that meeting, and that should be in writing. So they have the right to confirm that outcome of that appeal meeting in writing. So whether you're upholding that dismissal, potentially upholding that decision, or whether you're maybe doing a different outcome. Now, unless you have something different written within your policies, usually you only have one right of appeal. So clarify as well that that team member has no further right of appeal. And if they are remaining within the practice, important that both parties find a way to work forward. But also, if they are being dismissed, they have no further internal rights to challenge that decision. They would then have to potentially go to ACAS, early conciliation, a tribunal if they're still unhappy and want to take the matter further. Now, talking about early conciliation, your tribunals, that's why it's really important to keep those records. So keep those records and documentation of your one-to-one meetings, of your appraisals, your formal capability meetings, your competence records, your performance improvement plans. Have all those documented, signed, and keep them. Because if you end up in that tribunal situation, the tribunal will want to see those records to demonstrate that you have been a fair and reasonable employer and given that team member every opportunity to improve. Again, it's important to remember that to hold those documents confidentially, so in line with GDPR. Now, to give you an example, we recently had a practice who contacted us because they accidentally printed a appraisal to the reception printer, which sort of resulted in a number of the other team members reading that appraisal, which had a lot of concerns raised in them. So naturally, the team member whose appraiser it wasn't very happy and raised a grievance. And a grievance can take sort of 3-4 months sometimes to deal with, so a lot of your time. So I know it's really easily done, but do try and hold them confidentially in line with GDPR where you can. Now, we've talked a lot about your employed team members and how to manage their performance. So we're now going to talk about your self-employed team members. Now, with your self-employed team members, you can follow a condensed process because they don't have the same employment rights. However, we do recommend you try and mirror the employee process where you can. And the reason we recommend that is because if the self-employed team member is successful in claiming employee worker status, they may then subsequently be able to claim unfair dismissal if you've not followed the correct process. So it's really important to try and mirror that process where you can. One of the key things, though, with your self-employed team members to sort of mitigate that risk of them claiming employee status is to use different terminology. So don't follow that capability policy and procedure, don't issue that to them, but we recommend you call them potentially contract review meetings instead. But during those contract review meetings, you should be talking about what your concerns are. What is the poor performance that you have noticed? Why are you concerned about it? And explaining to that self-employed team member what your expectations are moving forward as well, so how you expect them to improve. And give them that opportunity to improve. Now, during these contract review meetings, because they're self-employed, the self-employed team member has no right to be accompanied. However, if they do request to be accompanied, it is good practice to consider those requests where you can. And again, like with your employees, if you're in the situation where you're considering refusing a request to be accompanied by your self-employed team members, please seek advice because there is also risk with that involved. Again, with your self-employed team members, because they are self-employed, they also have no right of appeal of your decision. Now, once you've had a number of contract review meetings with that team member, you've explained your concerns to them, you've explained your expectations, you've given them plenty of opportunity to improve, you may need to consider terminating that self-employed team member. Now, you can terminate them in line with the notice clause within their contract, and that's usually about 3 months' notice. Now, for your self-employed team members, we recommend that they work that notice. Because they are self-employed, they don't have the same employment rights again, so they work that 3 months' notice if you're terminating them. But you may also need to consider immediate termination. So with your immediate termination, it's important to ensure that you have immediate termination clauses within their contract for services. And with the particular situation you're in, it fits with those immediate termination clauses. So if you have those clauses in there, if the situation fits with one of those clauses, you may be able to consider immediately terminating that self-employed team member's contract. Now, there are a number of benefits of both informal and formal performance management. So this can include retention. So retention is sort of a key benefit, and it's well proven that if you are regularly communicating with your team members, they're more likely to stay with practice for longer. But also this regular communication helps improve morale. If you're also talking to them regularly about the standards you expect within the practice, the performance you expect within the practice, they are more likely to be efficient and effective. And that will really have a knock-on effect to your patient experience. When your patients come into the practice, they will notice that efficiency and that effectiveness, and they will have a better experience. Again, if they're also being more efficient, they're more effective, they're performing to a higher standard, they're going to be more productive, they're going to be more engaged, and they're going to be more motivated. Again, all of which your patients will notice. But also having a robust performance management procedure, implementing that within the practice, will help to support that you're a well-led practice as well. It will help to demonstrate that. However, unfortunately, where there are benefits, there are always going to be risks as well. Now, one of those of either not managing performance or potentially not managing it correctly is a drop in morale. Now, that's not just from your team member that's underperforming, but that's also from the rest of the team who are potentially having to pick up that additional workload. Again, absence is another knock-on effect. And again, it's not just for that one team member, it's for the rest of the team. So if there's particularly heightened workload, there may be additional stress. That may result in them becoming absent. And usually those reasons for absence are anxiety, stress, and depression, which I'm sure you appreciate it can be a bit more sensitive and difficult to deal with. It may also result in a grievance being raised. So again, this is more likely to be from your team members who are picking up the additional work, who feel potentially you aren't managing that team member's performance. They may raise a grievance about that. And as I mentioned earlier, grievances can sometimes take 3 or 4 months to deal with. So that's another process that you will have to go through. Now, with your capability processes, this can quite often take 6 to 12 months if you are following this sort of correctly. So by having a grievance procedure in that as well, it can take some time for you to deal with that. But also if you're not managing performance, there will be a reduced efficiency, reduced standards within your practice, which again your patients are likely to notice when they come in, and that may have a knock-on effect to your reputation. But also if you're not following the correct performance management process, there may be a failure to follow the ACAS guidelines for performance management. And also if you go down the route of a dismissal on the grounds of capability, if you haven't followed that correct process, the team member has more than 2 years service, they may be able to claim unfair dismissal. There may also be a claim for discrimination. Now that's not just from your employed team members, that could be from your self-employed team members as well. So if you have team members with potentially, say, medical condition, it's important that you're making those reasonable adjustments for them to ensure that you mitigate that risk for a discrimination claim. With your self-employed team members, they may also claim via a small claims court. So if they feel there's monies owed to them in accordance with their contract for services, they may try and claim those through a small claim court. With your self-employed team members, you also have a duty to ensure that they are fit and they are capable of carrying out procedures on patients. And if you don't, there may be a claim as well that you are breaching the Health and Social Care Act. So there's a number of risks with this procedure. So we have a number of key policies and templates on High Comply to help you document those conversations, build that audit trail as well to mitigate your risk. So we've got your staff appraisal questionnaires and reports, your performers appraisal questionnaires and reports, appraisal meeting list, that's the document where you can use to schedule the dates and times of all your appraisals, an appraisal overview, your capability policy and procedure that we've been talking about today, and your staff competence record. So we recommend a number of actions for next week. We recommend you review your capability policy and procedure. Check you've got one in place within your practice, check it's robust, check it's up to date, but also check that all your team members have seen this policy and they've read and signed it as well, and you've got a signed copy on file in case you need to escalate it to that procedure. We also recommend you review our appraisals overview document following today's webinar, so that will give you a bit more information in addition to today. We also recommend you consider introducing regular one-to-one meetings with your team members. So that will help with all those benefits we spoke about earlier, morale, engagement, and it will help you to also manage performance. Now we appreciate you are really busy within practices, so even if you can't implement these regularly, we recommend you introduce them as and when you have problems within your practice arise to help you manage them. We also recommend you review any outstanding actions from previous appraisals to ensure these are documented, these are completed, these are followed up on as well, to again help you manage that performance. So I'm just going to quickly recap on what we've covered today. So we've talked about informal performance management, what it is, how to do it and the benefits, how to conduct an appraisal, when to instigate the formal capability procedures, and how to use performance improvement plans and competence records as part of these formal procedures. We've also talked about how to manage your underperforming self-employed associates and how to minimise the risk of a tribunal. So this risk of a tribunal is why we've really implemented the Total HR and Employment Law Service. So as part of the Total HR service, we support you in implementing your contracts within the practice. Now that's for your employed team members and your self-employed team members. We also support you with introducing that staff handbook. And we review both these documents on an annual basis to ensure their compliance. So for instance, with GDPR. We also offer a web application to help you manage your staff sickness and holiday. And you can also store documents on this web application. So for instance, that could be your capability documents. You'll also have unlimited access to your designated code HR advisor who will be able to provide you with editing support. So that will include support with drafting letters. And again, that can include your capability letters. There's also additional employment protection cover available, which includes costs and tribunals. So if you are interested, please give our professional services team a call. So to make you aware of some upcoming events that we've got our Code Compliance Update event in Birmingham on Friday the 3rd of May 2019. So please have a look at our website for a bit more detail, and a bit more information will be released shortly as well. We've also got the remaining 4 webinars in our series, which will be coming up in the new year. And again, we'll release a bit more details about those in due course. But in the meantime, you may also wish to have a look on our website at our guidance, our code guidance for HR and employment law. So please download that document and have a look through as well if you want to. If you've missed any of our previous webinars, again, please follow the link on the screen and you'll be able to watch any of them at your leisure as well.